I used to think of the world in numbers. Not in dollars or cents, but in the math of survival. 150 more deliveries to get a dent in the rent. 300 to avoid that second notice on the car payment. 2 more hours on my feet until I could finally go home, pull off my worn-out shoes, and maybe, just maybe, get a few hours of sleep before doing it all over again. My name is Maya, and for the last 2 years, I've been a ghost. That's what you are when you deliver food. People see the brown paper bag, the cardboard box, the promise of a warm meal. They don't see the person holding it. My world was a blur of anonymous doorways and hurried handoffs, a quiet desperation that hummed beneath the surface of every have a nice day. Each day was a tightrope walk over a financial abyss, with every single bill feeling like a gust of wind trying to knock me off balance. My uniform was a constant reminder of my place in the world, a faded polo shirt, stained from 1,000 spilled lattes, and a pair of jeans with a hole in the knee. That was my armor, my reality. But on one sweltering Tuesday, my reality was about to collide with a world that was the exact opposite of mine. The address on the app led me to a building that didn't just touch the sky, it owned it. A sleek, obsidian monolith of steel and glass. I felt out of place before I even stepped inside. The lobby was a symphony of cool marble and quiet opulence. A single, enormous abstract painting hung on one wall, probably worth more than my entire family had ever earned. I walked past the receptionist, a woman with a perfect smile and a watch on her wrist that gleamed like a tiny, golden star. The elevator ride up was a slow, agonizing ascent. I could feel the contrast between me and this place pressing in. When the doors finally opened, I found myself in a different kind of silence, a cold, sterile stillness that only comes with immense power. The room was a vast, mahogany-paneled boardroom. 15 men in perfectly tailored suits sat around a long table, their expressions a mix of concentration and exhaustion. They were accountants, their hair thinning, and their faces etched with the stress of staring at numbers for a living, just like me. But they were looking at different numbers. Each of them had a thick binder open in front of them, filled with spreadsheets and dense legal text. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the low murmur of whispered figures. And at the head of the table sat him, the CEO, a man whose name was so synonymous with success it was in the news almost every day. He wasn't talking. He was just sitting there, a solid statue of a man, his pen hovering just above a signature line on a document that was probably worth more than I could ever imagine. The final piece of a deal I had read about on my phone that morning, a multi-billion-dollar acquisition. I went to the head of the table, carefully placing the delivery order on the glossy wood. A few of the men glanced up, their eyes passing over me without a flicker of recognition. I was invisible, just as I was on every other delivery. But as I set the bag down, my gaze fell on the open document in front of the CEO. I saw a line of numbers, and my heart stopped. It was the valuation of the company he was about to acquire, a number I had seen in the news countless times. But something was off. My mind, so accustomed to doing quick mental math on grocery totals and gas mileage, immediately zeroed in on the error. It wasn't a small mistake. It was huge, a rounding error so massive it could change everything. For a split second, I told myself to walk away. This wasn't my problem. My job was to deliver the food, not to get involved in corporate deals. I was a ghost, remember? I could just leave, go back to my anonymous life, and forget I ever saw this. But the voice of my dad, a man who always told me to speak up for what was right, echoed in my head. And the number, that glaring, undeniable error, burned in my mind. And against every bit of common sense, against every instinct that told me to stay silent and invisible, I took a deep breath, and the words tumbled out before I could stop them. Don't sign this. The room went absolutely, terrifyingly silent. The hum of the air conditioner was suddenly deafening. 15 heads, a mix of disbelief, confusion, and raw fury, swiveled to stare at me. The CEO's pen stopped hovering over the contract and slowly, deliberately, he looked up, his eyes a cold, steel gray. My heart was pounding, a frantic drumbeat against my ribs. I had done the unthinkable. I, a girl in a worn-out uniform, had just interrupted a multi-billion-dollar deal. So I have to ask you, honestly, what would you have done? Would you have stayed silent and walked away, or would you have spoken up and risked everything? Every story like this, every hour of research, every word of the script, takes countless hours of work to put together. And the only way we can keep bringing you stories like this is with your support. So if you want us to keep crafting these deep dives into fascinating true stories, please take a second to hit that subscribe button. It's the best way to support the channel and make sure we can continue this journey together. And that's when I knew, in that moment of complete, deafening silence, that I had either just made the biggest mistake of my life or the most important decision I would ever make. The only question was, which one? It turns out, a moment of courage is a lot like a fragile glass vase. It feels solid when you're holding it, but one wrong move, one sharp word, and it shatters into a million pieces. I had just shattered mine. The silence in that boardroom was heavier than the skyscraper itself. The CEO, his name was Arthur Vance, slowly lowered his pen. I had only ever seen his face on a magazine cover, a stoic, unreadable mask. But in person, up close, you could see the years in his eyes. He wasn't some silver spoon heir. His story was a business legend. A kid from a steel town who built his first company in a garage, brick by brick, failure by failure. His reputation was his currency, built on a foundation of integrity. He was known for making ruthless but honest deals. He was a shark, but a shark with a code. This deal, however, fell off. "And who are you?" A voice cut through the stillness. It wasn't Vance. It was the man next to him, a younger guy with a blindingly white smile and a tailored suit that probably cost more than my entire apartment's rent. His name was Julian Croft, Vance's right-hand man, his trusted advisor. He had a reputation of his own, a financial wunderkind, a master negotiator, and the charming face of Vance's empire. He looked at me, and his smile didn't reach his eyes. It was cold, a predator's smile. "She's the delivery girl," one of the accountants mumbled, a bead of sweat tracing a line down his temple. The words hit me like a physical blow. The delivery girl. That's all I was. The title was a dismissal, a statement of my irrelevance. Julian's smile widened. "I see. Our friend here appears to have an opinion on our multi-billion-dollar merger. An opinion on numbers, no less. Perhaps we should ask her to run our next audit." A few of the other accountants snickered nervously. I felt my face flush. The feeling of courage I had a moment ago was now a searing wave of humiliation. I wanted to disappear, to melt into the polished marble floor. Julian leaned forward, his voice a low, condescending purr. "Sweetheart, this deal has been vetted by 15 of the best financial minds in the city for 6 months. With all due respect, I think we'll stick to their analysis." And that's when I saw it. The flicker in his eyes. It was too fast for anyone else to catch. A brief flash of something, not panic, but maybe a desperate need to shut me up. A calculated impatience that felt like a lie. Then Vance spoke. His voice was a low rumble, and his gaze was fixed on me. "What did you see?" Julian's smile stiffened, and he shot a warning look at Vance. "Arthur, we don't have time for this." "I asked her a question, Julian." Vance didn't raise his voice, but the finality in his tone was absolute. My mouth was dry. I took a shaky breath and pointed a trembling finger at the document. "The valuation, the numbers on the acquisition, they're wrong. The market analysis, it's off by a factor of 10. The valuation is inflated. The company you're acquiring, it's not worth a tenth of what this contract says it is." Julian laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "And she bases this on what?" A quick glance. I shook my head, my voice finding a shaky strength. "No, sir. I've seen this company in the news. Everyone has. It's been public knowledge for months that they've been in trouble. Their stock is tanking. The numbers in this contract, they're from a projection a year ago. A fantasy. They don't reflect the current reality." The room was silent again, but this time it was different. Julian was no longer smiling. Arthur Vance was no longer a statue. He was looking at the contract, then at me, then back at the contract. The accountants around the table were shuffling papers, their faces pale. "That's absurd," Julian said, his voice hard. "The valuation was approved by all of our analysts." He glared at the accountants, a silent threat in his eyes. "Yes, of course, Julian," one of them stammered. We ran the numbers. They're correct. But the stammer, the way they avoided eye contact. It didn't feel right. My gut, The same one that told me which neighborhoods to avoid after dark and which delivery orders were too good to be true, was screaming at me. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Vance slowly closed the binder, his eyes never leaving mine. "Thank you for the delivery," he said, his voice unreadable. It was a clear dismissal. The conversation was over. As I turned and walked out, I could feel Julian's eyes boring into my back. In the hallway, I passed a small office with the door ajar. I could hear voices, hushed, intense. I hesitated, my hand on the elevator button, and then I just stopped. "I don't care what she said." Julian's voice, now stripped of its charming veneer, was low and furious. "The deal goes through. The numbers are what they are. You all confirmed them. You're not going to betray him now. Not for a delivery girl. You all know what's at stake here." I heard another voice, a pleading whisper. "Julian, this is a crime. It's fraud. Arthur will lose everything." Julian's response was cold and final. "Arthur trusts me. He'll sign, and you will not say a word." I froze. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. Julian was a liar. He was manipulating everyone, including his own partner. The accountants were terrified. The numbers weren't just a mistake. It was a fraud. A setup. He was bleeding Vance's company dry from the inside. My mind reeled. Why would Julian do this? Vance had given him everything. But then I remembered the ruthless ambition I had seen in Julian's eyes. It wasn't about integrity, it was about power. This merger was a Trojan horse, a way to seize control, to watch Vance's empire crumble so he could build his own on the ashes. My knees felt weak. The stakes had just multiplied 100-fold. This wasn't just about a wrong number. It was about Vance's life's work, his reputation, and the livelihoods of thousands of people who worked for him. All of it was on a cliff's edge, about to fall. And the only thing standing between them and disaster was me, a delivery girl with a gut feeling. I was nothing. I had no evidence. No one would believe me. I was just a girl who had stumbled into a world of power and greed, a world where the rules were different. I could walk away. I could go back to my life, to my deliveries, and forget any of this ever happened. It wasn't my fight. The sensible thing to do was to save myself. So I have to ask you, what would you do? Would you chase down proof, even if you had nothing, even if no one would believe you, and put yourself in the crosshairs of a very dangerous man? Or would you turn your back on all of it to save yourself? The elevator doors opened. I could get in and disappear. The choice was a simple one. But for me, it wasn't simple at all. Because I couldn't shake the image of Arthur Vance, a man who built his life on integrity, about to lose everything to a hidden enemy. And I knew, in that moment, that I had a terrible choice to make. I could either be a ghost or a witness. That day, the elevator doors closed on more than just a floor. They closed on my old life, the one where I was a ghost, the one where I just delivered the meal, got paid, and went home. But I couldn't just get in and leave. I couldn't be a ghost when a man's life's work and the livelihoods of thousands of people was about to be stolen. So I became a different kind of ghost. I became a spy. Over the next few days, the delivery uniform became my disguise. I learned the building's rhythms. I knew when the lunch rush was, when the security guards changed shifts, when the cleaning crew started their rounds. The polished marble floors of the lobby became my hunting ground. I slipped in and out of the building, a shadow among the suits. I wasn't just delivering food anymore. I was delivering myself into a conspiracy. My first target was the weak link, the nervous accountant from the boardroom, the one who had stammered when Julian had looked at him. I found him one afternoon, standing alone on the sidewalk, smoking a cigarette, his shoulders hunched. His name, I'd learned, was Mark. I approached him cautiously. "Excuse me," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I was the delivery girl from the other day. He flinched, his eyes darting up and down the street. "Look, I don't know anything, okay? You should just go. You're going to get yourself into a lot of trouble." "You look scared in there." I pressed, my heart pounding. "You knew something was wrong, didn't you? Julian threatened you." He took a long, shaky drag from his cigarette. "Julian doesn't just threaten," he said, the words barely audible. "He makes it so you have no choice. He promised to ruin us. Our careers, our families, he knew what we were dealing with. He knew we were just trying to put food on the table, just like you. His words were like a gut punch. He was just like me. He was a number, a disposable part of the machine. Julian had preyed on their fear, their vulnerability. He had created an enemy from within. Mark didn't give me any specific information, but he didn't have to. The look on his face, the quiet terror in his eyes, that was all the confirmation I needed. The fraud was real. A few days later, Julian saw me. I was waiting in the lobby, pretending to check my phone, and our eyes met. He didn't smile this time. He just looked at me with a chilling, knowing stare. The next day, my account was flagged. A note came from corporate. It said there had been an official complaint about my professionalism. My ratings, which had been perfect, suddenly dropped. My delivery requests were cut in half. Julian's first counterattack. He was trying to push me out of the game. He was trying to make me disappear for good. I nearly gave up. The humiliation was a raw, burning thing in my stomach. What was I even doing? I was a delivery girl. I had no business playing corporate spy. The bills were piling up again, and with my income cut, I was heading for a financial cliff. I told myself to walk away. It was a fool's errand. I was going to lose everything for a man I didn't even know, and a fight that wasn't mine. But every time I thought about giving up, I saw Arthur Vance's face in my mind. A man who built something from nothing, a man of integrity. I saw Mark's terrified eyes, and the fire in my gut, the hunger for truth, burned hotter than the fear. So I went back. I became bolder. I started looking for fragments, discarded notes in trash cans, overheard conversations in the hallway. I was a human vacuum cleaner, sucking up every bit of information I could find. I found one accountant's discarded notes, scribbled calculations in the margins of a report. The numbers looked right, but then I saw a different page, a summary with the same numbers, but the final totals were subtly different. They'd been edited, manually. The real numbers were buried deep beneath the surface, hidden from plain sight. I had to get to the source, the copy room. It was the heart of the operation, the place where the final documents were printed. I waited until the building was nearly empty, just the cleaning crew and a few overworked stragglers. I slipped in, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. The copy machine hummed to life. I found the printer log, scrolling through the recent documents. And there it was, the contract. I grabbed my phone and snapped a quick, blurry photo of a single page, a summary of the financials, showing the real, much lower valuation. It was my smoking gun, my only piece of physical evidence. As I was leaving the room, Julian appeared in the doorway. He wasn't smiling anymore. He looked at me with a cold fury that made my blood run cold. "You're very persistent, aren't you?" he said, his voice a low, menacing rumble. I clutched my phone, my knuckles white. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you don't. You're just a delivery girl. But this is not your world. This is our world, and you don't belong here. Walk away. Stop digging. You're going to get crushed." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. He wasn't just going to ruin me. He was going to make sure I disappeared. My knees were shaking, but a strange sense of calm settled over me. He was scared. He had to be, or he wouldn't be here, threatening me. My gut had been right. All of my crazy theories, all of my sneaking around, had led me to the truth. So I have to ask you, honestly, if someone in power, someone with the ability to destroy your life, threatened you to keep quiet, would you stop? Would you run? Or would you push even harder, knowing you were finally on the right track? I turned and walked away from Julian, his words echoing in my head. I had the photo. It was blurry, it was circumstantial, but it was all I had. Now, I just had to get it to the one person who needed to see it most. The only person who could stop the deal. I had to get back into Arthur Vance's office. Getting into that building the next day was a different kind of mission. I wasn't a ghost anymore. I was a target. Every security guard looked a little too long. Every receptionist seemed to be watching. But Julian's threat, his promise to crush me, had backfired. It didn't make me run. It gave me purpose. I had a blurry photo, a handful of cryptic notes, and a gut feeling. But that wasn't enough to take down a man as powerful as Julian Croft. I had to find allies. My focus shifted from the villain to his victims. The accountants. I had seen their fear, their quiet desperation. They weren't bad men, they were scared men. Julian had preyed on their weaknesses, on the everyday vulnerabilities that all of us carry. It was time to find out what those were. I started small. I found Mark, the nervous accountant, on the sidewalk again. This time, I didn't just talk about the deal. I asked him about himself, about his life, and he started to open up. He told me he had a sick mother and the medical bills were drowning him. He couldn't afford to lose his job, couldn't afford to be blacklisted by Julian. He wasn't a criminal. He was a son trying to do right by his family. After Mark, I found another accountant, a quiet man named David. I caught him in the break room, staring into his coffee with a hollow look in his eyes. He confessed that he was on the verge of bankruptcy. He had made some bad investments years ago, and Julian had found out. Julian had promised to make the problem go away if he just looked the other way. One by one, they came out of the shadows. I heard stories of career fears, of kids in college, of gambling debts that spiraled out of control. Julian wasn't just a partner, he was a master manipulator. He had a file on every single one of them. He had created a web of blackmail, a system of quiet coercion that had left them all feeling trapped and hopeless. They didn't lie because they were bad people. They lied because they were terrified. I knew my blurry photo wasn't enough. It was my word against Julian's, and with him, it wasn't just a question of who was more credible. It was a question of who had more power. And I had none. The accountants were my only hope. They had to be the ones to break the silence. I decided to gather the few who had started to trust me. We met in a small coffee shop down the street from the skyscraper. They were fidgety and nervous, their eyes darting to the door every time it opened. They looked at me, this delivery girl, like I was insane. And maybe I was. "Look," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I know you're all scared. Julian has you cornered. He's made you feel like you have no choice. But you do. You have a choice. You can live in fear for the rest of your lives, or you can face this head-on together." They shifted uncomfortably in their seats. David shook his head. "He'll ruin us. He'll make sure we never work again. He'll destroy our reputations." "But he's a liar," I said, my voice rising a little. "He's a fraud. And if you go down with him, what's your reputation then? He's using you. He's not your savior. He's a disease. He'll always have something over you. This isn't just about this one deal. This is about your lives. And your freedom." I knew words weren't enough. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. I had been recording my last conversation with Julian, just in case. The one where he had threatened me. I pressed play, and his voice filled the quiet coffee shop. His low, menacing rumble. "You don't belong here. Walk away before you're crushed." The men around the table fell silent, their eyes wide. The recording was short, a snippet of a threat, but it was enough. It was the truth. They heard the cold, calculating cruelty in his voice, the one he hid so well behind his charming facade. The silence that followed was different from the one in the boardroom. This one wasn't born of fear. It was born of revelation. The web of quiet blackmail had finally started to unravel. One of the accountants, a stern, older man named Richard, placed his hands flat on the table. "He's right, isn't he?" "She's right. He's been doing this for years. This isn't the first time. It's just the biggest." What was once a unanimous silence began to crack. A few of them began to talk, their voices low and urgent, confessing the little things they had been forced to do, the numbers they had been told to ignore. They weren't alone anymore. They had each other. Just then my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Mr. Vance wants to see you." Now. His office. My heart leaped into my throat. Julian must have seen me. He must have told Vance. He was going to turn me in. This was it. I was going to be banned forever. But when I got to the boardroom, it was empty. The lights were off, and the place looked ghostly. Arthur Vance was standing by the window, staring out at the city he had built. He didn't turn around. He just spoke, his voice low and tired. "You've been very busy, young lady. My security team tells me you've been meeting with my accountants, spreading rumors, telling them to turn against my partner. I want to hear it from you. One last time. Why should I believe you?" His loyalty, his decades-long partnership with Julian, was a fortress, and I was standing outside it, unarmed, with nothing but a photo and a plea. I knew this was my one shot, my final chance to prove that everything he thought he knew was a lie. I looked at him, a tired old man who was about to lose everything. "Don't sign that contract," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "He's a liar, and he's going to use you to steal your company." My words hung in the air, a final, desperate plea. He turned and looked at me, a long, searching gaze, and I knew, in that moment, that everything depended on what I said next. I had to convince him that Julian wasn't the man he thought he was. I had to tell him the truth, the whole truth, or be cast out forever. So I have to ask you, have you ever had to try and convince someone to do something they were too afraid to do? What would you say? What would you do to win them over? The silence was the only answer. Arthur Vance was waiting, and I had a decision to make. Either I had to lay out the truth, no matter how unbelievable it sounded, or turn and walk away forever. He had me cornered. His words, low and serious, hung in the air. "Why should I believe you?" I took a deep breath. This was it. I laid out everything, the doctored numbers I had seen, the way Julian had manipulated the accountants, the threats he'd made. I told him about Mark and his sick mother, about David and his financial struggles. I told him how Julian had taken away their choice, how he had turned good men into accomplices out of fear. I ended by showing him the blurry photo on my phone. "It's all I have," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I know it's real. Julian is going to destroy your company, Mr. Vance. He's going to use this deal to steal everything you've worked for." Vance didn't react. He just stood there, looking out the window, a man lost in thought. I had said my piece. I had done everything I could. Now it was up to him. He was the one who had to make a choice, believe his loyal, trusted partner of 2 decades, or believe a delivery girl he had met only a week ago. Just then, the door swung open. Julian walked in, his face a mask of false concern. "Arthur, are you all right? I heard there was a misunderstanding." His eyes, however, were fixed on me, a venomous glare that promised swift and brutal retaliation. "This girl is a problem. I've heard she's been spreading lies, trying to stir up trouble." He took out his own phone and showed Vance a document. I had my team do some digging. "She has a history, a long history of fabricating things, of making up stories to get attention." He looked at me with a sickeningly sweet smile. "I'm told she's a bit of a habitual troublemaker, with some mental health issues." The air in the room grew cold. The words hit me like a physical blow. Mentally unstable. A scammer. A liar. He was painting a picture of me that was so completely false, so perfectly crafted, it was nearly impossible to argue against. He had anticipated my move. He had a counterattack ready. I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Julian had taken everything I had, my credibility, my reputation, my courage, and ripped it to shreds. He had turned my honesty into a weakness. He had weaponized my very existence as a nobody. The lie was so big, so bold, that it felt more real than the truth. Vance looked at the document on Julian's phone. Then he looked at me. His face was unreadable. "I think you should leave," he said to me, his voice flat. "Now. I won't have this kind of drama in my company." He didn't just dismiss me, he dismissed the entire story. The truth. My world collapsed. My knees went weak. 2 security guards appeared as if on cue, taking my arms and gently, but firmly, escorting me out of the office. Out of the building. I was banished. Just like that. I walked the streets in a daze, the city lights a blurry, distorted mess. I felt like a fool. I had risked everything. My job, my financial stability, my sanity. For what? For a man who didn't believe me, for people who were too scared to stand up for themselves. The humiliation was a raw, burning sensation. I found a quiet alley and just slid down to the cold concrete, the city's noise a million miles away. Tears streamed down my face, a hot and messy release of all the fear and frustration and despair that had been building inside me for days. Had I ruined my life for nothing? Had I lost my job, my future, my last shred of self-respect for a lost cause? Hours passed. The city grew quiet. The streetlights flickered on. The tears eventually stopped, leaving my face sticky and cold. I pulled out my phone. The blurry photo was still there. Julian's menacing words were still there in the recording. And then I remembered. Not just the words, but the faces. Mark, his eyes filled with a desperate hope. David, his face etched with worry for his family. I remember my dad's voice, telling me to always fight for what's right, even when no one else would. Julian's lie was big, but the truth was bigger. I wasn't a villain. I wasn't mentally unstable. I was a delivery girl who had seen something wrong and had the guts to say something. I was a person who had listened when no one else would. I got up, my body stiff and cold, but my mind clear. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about them. The accountants. The people who had trusted me. They had risked everything just by talking to me. I couldn't let them be crushed. I couldn't let Arthur Vance lose everything because I was too afraid to try one last time. The next morning, the accountants received an email. The final meeting was set. The contract would be signed at 10 a.m. The deal was happening. Julian had won. I went to the building. This time, I didn't sneak in. I walked straight to the front desk. "I'm here to see the CEO," I said, my voice steady. "My name is Maya." The receptionist laughed. "Honey, you can't be serious. He's in a closed-door meeting." Just then, Mark, the nervous accountant, walked by. He saw me, and a look of surprise, then resolve crossed his face. He nodded at me, a subtle gesture that said, "We're with you." I turned back to the receptionist. "I need you to tell him that Julian's deal is a fraud, that I have proof." The receptionist's smile faded. She picked up the phone to call security. But before she could, two other accountants, Richard and David, appeared beside Mark. They stood tall, shoulders back, a quiet army of defiance. "We're with her," Mark said, his voice surprisingly firm. "We have something to tell Mr. Vance." My heart soared. They had rallied. What was once a scattered group of terrified men had become a united front. Their fear had finally transformed into courage. I wasn't an outsider anymore. I was their leader, the leader of the silenced. "So I have to ask you, would you risk your entire future to save someone else's empire? Would you put yourself in the line of fire, knowing that your life could be torn apart just to do the right thing?" I knew my answer. I looked at the receptionist, then at the two towering security guards who were now walking toward us, and then back at the accountants. And I knew in that moment that we had come too far to turn back. We had a chance, and we were going to take it, but we were about to find out if it was a chance worth taking. All I could see were two massive security guards, their faces impassive, their bodies a wall between me and the boardroom. But this time I wasn't alone. Behind me stood the accountants, Mark, David, Richard, their faces pale, but their shoulders set with a newfound resolve. We were a fragile army, armed with nothing but the truth. "We're with her," Mark repeated, his voice surprisingly firm. The receptionist looked from them to me, her perfectly made-up face etched with confusion. "Sir, they're insisting." The security guards moved to block us, but before they could, the doors to the boardroom opened. Arthur Vance stood in the doorway. He looked at me, then at the accountants, and his eyes narrowed. He was a man accustomed to order, and this was chaos. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. Julian's voice, a smooth and oily purr, came from inside. "It's nothing, Arthur. Just the delivery girl and her little group of conspirators. They're trying to derail the deal with wild accusations." Vance held up a hand. "Let them in. All of them." Julian's face went white. The security guards hesitated, then stepped aside. We walked into the lion's den. The room was grander than I remembered, the mahogany table gleaming under the crystal chandelier. At the head of the table was the contract, a single, pristine document waiting for a signature. Julian stood beside it, radiating confidence. Other executives sat around the table, their expressions a mix of impatience and annoyance. Julian smiled at me, a condescending, venomous expression. "Last chance, sweetheart. Go home before you make a bigger fool of yourself." I didn't answer him. I walked to the center of the room, my phone in my hand. I was shaking, but my hands were steady. I felt the weight of all the people who were counting on me. I saw Mark's mother, David's kids. I saw the thousands of employees who would lose everything if Julian succeeded. It wasn't just about me anymore. "You're wrong, Julian," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. "I'm not a fool. You are. Because you underestimated me." He laughed. A short, Sharp, theatrical sound. You're just a delivery girl. What could you possibly know? I raise my phone. I know that this deal is a fraud. I know you doctored the numbers. I know you threatened these men to make them keep quiet. Julian's face hardened. That's a ridiculous accusation. I have documents. I have testimony. Every single accountant here approved the deal. He pointed a finger at the men who stood with me. They flinched, but they didn't back down. I pressed a button on my phone. A clear, crisp recording began to play. Julian's voice, stripped of its charm, filled the room. I don't care what she said. The deal goes through. You're not going to betray him now. You all know what's at stake here. The executives around the table gasped. Arthur Vance's eyes were fixed on the men I had brought with me. Julian had called them conspirators, but now they looked like victims. Mark stepped forward, his voice a shaky whisper. It's true, Mr. Vance. He told me he'd ruin my family if I didn't comply. Another accountant, a man named Roger, stood up, his face pale with shame. He found out about my gambling debts. He threatened to expose me to my wife. One by one, they rose from their chairs. A domino effect of confession. The silence was broken by the quiet, tearful admissions of men who had been living in fear for months. They confessed to the doctored numbers, the inflated valuations, the web of lies Julian had woven. What was once unanimous silence was now a chorus of truth. Julian stood there, his face a grotesque mask of fury and disbelief. He had lost control. He tried to speak, but the words were a jumble of excuses and pathetic insults. They're lying. They're all lying. She got to them. She's a manipulator. But no one was listening. Arthur Vance's face, which had been a mask of stoic disbelief, was now a portrait of cold fury. He looked at Julian, the man he had trusted like a son, and the betrayal was a living, breathing thing in his eyes. He slowly reached across the table, and with a final, decisive movement, he slammed the contract shut. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent room. This ends now, he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He turned to Julian. You are not only a fraud, but you have destroyed the integrity of good men. Get out. Get out of my company. Get out of my life. Julian lunged at me, his face twisted with rage. You did this. You and your worthless friends. But before he could reach me, the two security guards grabbed his arms, holding him in a vice-like grip. He was powerless. He was nothing. The brilliant, charming schemer was a broken man, his empire of lies crumbling around him. The guards let him out, kicking and screaming obscenities. The room was silent once more. The executives around the table looked from Vance to me, their faces a mix of shock and shame. Arthur Vance stood there for a long moment, his shoulders slumped. He looked at me, this delivery girl who had saved his company, and his eyes were filled with a raw, undeniable gratitude. He had to fire Julian, of course, but the mess wasn't over. The fallout would be immense. The company's reputation would be tarnished. The stock would probably plummet. But he would rebuild. He would do it honestly, with integrity. So I have to ask you honestly, if you were in that room, knowing Julian's power, knowing the risks, would you have stood with the accountants, or would you have stayed silent out of fear? The story of the delivery girl who saved a billionaire wasn't over. It was just beginning. The contract, once the centerpiece of a multi-billion-dollar fraud, now sat on the mahogany table like a tombstone. Julian was gone, but the silence he left behind was filled with 1,000 things: relief, shock, and the quiet, heavy realization of what had almost happened. Arthur Vance, the man who had built an empire on integrity, looked at the accountants who had stood with me. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He just nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a deep, weary sadness. Then, one by one, he looked at each of them. You are not your debts, he said to David. You are not your mistakes, he said to Mark. You are men of integrity, and from now on, that is all that will matter here. The accountants, the men who had been living in the shadows of Julian's threats, were no longer pawns. They were free. They were professionals with voices again. Mark looked at me, a tear tracking a line down his cheek. You saved us, he whispered. And in that moment, the weeks of fear, the humiliation, the tears, it all faded away. It had been worth it, every single moment of it. Later, Arthur Vance met me in his office. It was no longer a place of sterile intimidation. It felt different. He looked at me, a girl in a delivery uniform that now felt like a superhero costume. You know, I built this company on trust. Julian was my oldest friend, my partner. And you are a stranger, a delivery driver I met for a moment. But you had the courage to see something was wrong and to speak up when no one else would. He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. I want you to join my company. Not as a delivery driver. I want you to be a part of my team. I don't know what your title would be yet. All I know is that this company needs more people like you. People who aren't afraid to say the hard thing, to do the right thing. My heart stopped. Just a few weeks ago, my life was a relentless cycle of deliveries and mounting bills. My future was measured in miles driven and tips earned. Now, this man, this titan of industry, was offering me a future I couldn't have even dreamed of. It was a chance to transform my life. A chance to stop being a ghost and finally be seen. Months passed. The company recovered. The news stories were brutal at first. The headlines screamed about fraud and betrayal, but Arthur Vance faced it all with the same quiet integrity he had shown in the boardroom. He didn't hide. He apologized. He worked tirelessly to rebuild the company's reputation, and he did it with the men who had been wronged by Julian. I became a part of the new team. We all did. Mark and David, now free from their fears, were instrumental in the cleanup. They were no longer just accountants, they were leaders. And I was no longer a ghost. I had a desk, a phone that didn't just buzz with delivery orders, and a purpose that went far beyond making ends meet. My uniform was gone, replaced with professional clothes. But I never forgot where I came from. My life wasn't just transformed by one single act of courage. It was rebuilt. It was reshaped from the ground up. And so was the company. Arthur Vance and I became allies. We worked together, side by side, building a company that was stronger than before because it was now founded on truth. The old regime of quiet fear was replaced by open communication. It was a complete overhaul, an empire reshaped by one impulsive act of courage. A single voice speaking up when everyone else stayed silent. And it made me realize a powerful lesson. The truth can come from the most unexpected places, from the most invisible people. And courage isn't about status, or power, or a fancy title. It's about heart. It's about doing the right thing, even when it's the hardest thing. It's about finding your voice and using it to protect what you believe in. So I have to ask you, what about you? Have you ever spoken up when everyone else stayed silent, and did it change everything?